Good afternoon. I'm, I've been, I was elected, as you recall, and some of my colleagues from Ulster County are here, so I have to tell the truth. I was elected, as you just heard, in 1981, and so I've been coming to these meetings for a third of a century, which seems extraordinary to me. And I was actually on this board for a while, which was a great opportunity, and I made some really lifetime friends. First thing I did when I was elected was back the wrong person for chairman. The second thing I discovered was that I'd been assigned to the Mental Health Committee. I always thought there was some connection between those two things. And I began a 12-year seminar on how government really works. And I could regale you with stories about what I learned, many of which you have similar stories and you would already recognize and know, but that's not my purpose today. My purpose is to perhaps suggest to you by the time I finish speaking, which I hope will not be the usual professor's length, I expect it won't, to convince you that professors have something to give back after they've had the experience of helping to govern in what I regard as the most important local governments in New York. At the same time, I value all local governments in New York. I'm like a guy from Lake Wobegon. All my children are slightly above average. So, for you, those of you who know that radio show. So a third of a century, and when I look at the program, I find lots of the concerns are not new. We're worried about our relationship with the state, expectations, demands, limitations, and so on. We're worried about our relationship with each other. What can we learn from each other? We're concerned about how to govern effectively at as legislators and executives, and how we might interact with our employees to maximize performance for the people in our jurisdictions. We connect with local leaders across the country to try to gain understanding of best practices. So when you look at the general level, we're always concerned, we persist in our concern about the same things, even though the specific examples may differ. And at the same time, we're in an entirely new environment from time to time. I'm carrying a machine around in my pocket that has more power than the computers we used to run the college when I was first hired. And I'm always on that tether. Somebody can always find me. And that's not a happy circumstance sometimes. The diversity of our communities, I know in Oneida County, I talk to the press sometimes, in Oneida County about challenges there. The diversity of our populations is extending rapidly. And we're challenged to understand the demands and expectations of different cultures have of governments, not only in urban New York, but across rural New York. And these, in fact, in my opinion, are great strengths for New York as we attract people with high energy and commitment who will build our communities. So everything's the same and everything's different. Additionally, we're in a room of enormous diversity. I was reading a governing magazine the other day, and it said that there were 3,144 counties. I always thought there were 3,006 counties, so I have to go look for the other 138. But among those counties, 146 contain half the population of the country, and the rest, the other half. So think about the diversity of size and scale in our governments, which are all in the same category and yet have to act at different scale. In New York, the 6 biggest counties have budgets of over half the total spending of counties, 56%. I checked that out. And of course, New York City, which is a member of this association, has a budget of in excess of $73 billion. So the size and scale of governments doing the same thing is challenging, and we have to do the same thing in different ways in different places because of the scale challenge that we face. So we face great diversity. We try to find a common mission, achieve common missions in very different circumstances, and yet we face similar problems. I want to start with some premises that are very important. First, I always believed that the hierarchical presentation of government with the national government on the top and local governments at the bottom was a misrepresentation of, this triangle is a misrepresentation of importance. And I think the importance is just the reverse. I think that local governments are most impactful on people's daily life and most important in creating the quality of life, and in fact most important in creating opportunity. They're most connected with community. When I was in office and walked through the ShopRite, people would stop me and tell me what was on their mind. They knew I was a local elected official. I was more accessible than anybody, as a local official, than anybody working at this, in the state government or anybody working in the national government. In fact, people brought their state and their national concerns to me because they knew I was elected. They didn't know quite what I did, but they knew I was elected, and if they had something they wanted to talk about, I could help them make the right connection. So I start with the notion that we're very important in counties. And the people of the United States, in recent polls by the Pew Charitable Trust, express a favorable view of local government over state government and over national government. And that favorable view persists. And I think the reason for that is that you would see I identify, even though I'm long out of office, that we do the most important jobs for them. We're accessible, we're their neighbors, they know us, and they value those relationships because they know us and they trust us. So we should give consideration to that fact and not buy in to that pyramid when we're engaged with others. And I say that whether it's the governor or a congressman or a member of the U.S. Senate. It's a peer relationship, not a hierarchical relationship. Second premise is that the problems of local government have been wrongly defined and therefore wrongly understood. And I say this conceptually for your consideration. What do I mean by that? Well, I was on the Spitzer Commission. Some of you may remember that Stan Lundeen headed a commission on local government, would I call it reform? The word reform was not used probably because it arouses immediate enmity. But the governor met with us, and the first thing he told us was that there were too many governments. And the second thing he said, he implied or suggested that eliminating governments was the goal. And I must say, when Governor Cuomo, who I have high regard for, but Governor Cuomo was Attorney General and pushed through legislation addressing what he regarded as the principal problems of local government, he too defined the problem as too many governments. And I don't think that's a good way to define the problem. I don't think it's a good way to define the problem because it provokes people to take conventional positions of resistance before the conversation starts. So if we want, and we're going to talk a little today about how government, I'm going to talk a little bit, and you've been talking for the entire conference, and I'm sure we'll continue to consider it over time, how governments can work better together. And you don't start by telling some guy, we can work well together by eliminating you. That doesn't provoke collaboration. And so you get into the usual paradigmatic roles and responsibilities and the usual responses. And I'm a veteran of, you know, there are two Newports, there's a village and a town. We welcome your visiting us and seeing the beauty of the Hudson Valley for the same reason that various county executives have already mentioned, that is, we have a sales tax. Also, we think that we're worth visiting. That's a primary purpose to visit. So the two Newports have been unable to join into one community even though we're socially alike, culturally alike, religiously alike. There's no class enmity, there's no racial enmity that some places encounter, but we can't join. And we don't want to join, and there are powerful reasons for that. The sense of community is provoked by efforts to eliminate our village, and a deep historic connection to the village is challenged. So if we open up the conversation by saying, One of us has to go, and it's going to be you. We're not going to get very far. We have a record. Our record in school district consolidation is problematic lately, since the 1960s. Our record in encouraging villages to dissolve is problematic historically. In fact, there are villages being created almost as we meet and as we speak. So we have to find a different way to hold this conversation. There's another point that I would suggest to you is a problem, and I'm afraid that all of us in the room are guilty of it. And that point is the view that we're already doing it and we're already doing the best we can. So whenever I approach local government officials about collaboration, whenever I approach them about dealing with what they regard as the burdensome and oppressive actions of the state government, they say, doesn't the governor understand that we're already doing it, we're people of goodwill, we're talking to our neighbors, we're collaborating on highway projects, we're collaborating on a lot of matters, and we're doing the best we can. Well, that's a bad response to a crisis situation. The best reason, I see Tom Santulli here, who in ancient times had conversations with me and was a leader and a pioneer in collaboration among governments in highway maintenance and service delivery. You know, the idea is we have to think harder and better about what we're doing. We have to find good ways of doing things. One of the great examples is assessment. You know, classically, historically, many people believe that the assessment function should be a county function, and it is a county function in a couple of places in New York. But it's a change that requires, has a very arduous constitutional barrier to shift the function formally. Well, some counties have found ways to shift the function informally through contractual arrangements. So instead of saying we can't do it and we won't do it, those places found a way to do it without sort of a workaround, I suppose you'd call it, bypassing the constitutional requirements by doing something contractually where the county essentially is helping localities cut costs and provide quality, full value assessment. Now I'm an old man, so I'll have to defer naming the places that do it until I find them in my notes. But we did a recent study for Northern Dutchess, and we, well, those are the ones that do county level assessment, but there are some counties. Does anybody want to volunteer that information? There's a county that does by contract. Yes? Orleans County and Clinton County. So an example of, instead of saying we already do it the best we can, finding a way to do it and seeing if it's desirable. And there's lots of steps. You've got great speakers showing you how to lead in that circumstance that I could offer some examples too. But that's a third barrier. Now, let me say that all this notion about avoiding the conventional pitfalls, nevertheless, we have to understand that some premises that bring us to this moment in history are true. I was talking earlier today with a gentleman, and I said, you know, the counties were largely in place as governments. Their boundaries were set by 1898. Nassau County was created in 1898, and Bronx County in New York City was created in 1914. So we've had this set of boundaries, not barriers, but boundaries for 100 years. And the towns have been substantially in place for that long. Villages have had some changes. We haven't created a city since 1942 in New York, and that's purposeful. The state doesn't want any more cities created in New York, and creating them requires state action. So before we had the automobile, we had the current boundaries. Before we had the computer, before we had all the conveniences that we understand in modern life. In other words, technology has transformed life, but we haven't transformed our premises, our structure, our defining boundaries. So
we are operating in an organizational paradigm that's old. Now, we might want to defend it, but if we want to defend it and not give consideration to alternative boundaries, which I'm arguing we shouldn't do because we provoke people and we don't end up getting much done, or we can't do most of the time, almost all the time, then we have to recognize that we have to find alternatives. We have to find alternatives to transcending the heritage of 19th century structures in the 21st century. No corporation would operate in this paradigm. In fact, Drucker, the great corporate analyst of corporate organization, has argued that there should be creative destruction in corporate operations every generation. We choose not to do that, perhaps for good reason. But we have to find ways to operate this system, or this, what I call network. It's not a system, because system work suggests somebody designed it. It grew, it evolved. We have to find ways to do that then creatively and in different ways, and through different paths. So, the myths. Let's not say we can't do it. Let's not accept that we're at the bottom of the pyramid. Let's not attack other people's existence at the start of the conversation. Let's instead start thinking functionally and operationally about how we can work together better. Now let's take a look, and let me come back to that in a minute. I want to go take a look at what the governor has done and with regard to the property tax and characterize it a little differently. Now we think that the property tax is our money. By we, I mean we local governments. It's the primary source of discretionary resource we have. Certainly, massively true in school districts. Counties have the privilege of having the sales tax. Cities have a claim on the sales tax. Other jurisdictions gather that money either because state law requires a certain sharing or a local discretion provides a certain sharing depending on the locality. But that property tax, that's ours. So here comes the governor and he says, I don't want you to be able to raise that property tax at the level that meets your needs if you determine that you want it to be raised to meet those needs at that level. I want there to be a cap. And here comes the governor and he says, I want you to give me a plan to reduce your budgets by a percentage a year for 3 years in your property tax, and if you don't give me that plan, I'm not going to give a rebate to your citizens, and I'm going to tell them that it's because you didn't give me that plan. In other words, he's creating a very challenging environment for us. Now, why is the governor doing that? Well, what we need to understand, and I'm not making the argument, I'm just saying march a mile in the guy's shoes. What we need to understand is that he thinks that the property tax level among the highest in the United States is a major barrier to the economic renewal of upstate New York and all of New York. And his frustration is the same frustration that governors classically have with school aid. It's very hard to control, very hard to control. So he's saying if this is a big statewide issue and I want to influence it and I don't have control over the decision process, how can I influence it? So he's trying to drive us to do something that he thinks is of statewide importance, and he's telling us how to spend our money, in effect, or how much of our money we can spend in order to do that. Now what's interesting to me about this, Steve told me to give the speech I gave in the Hudson Valley, and I'm giving a different speech. So I hope you're not mad at me, Steve.
You're doing great.
I forgot what I was going to say. No. What's interesting to me about this is that the governor wants us to do what we want to do. But we don't want somebody to tell us to do it or force us to do it. Now, I remember being in a lot of rooms in Ulster County between 1981 and 1993 where we were making budgets. Actually, the first years they wouldn't let me in the room. I was on the mental health committee.
But ultimately, through a series of circumstances hard to fathom, I actually got into the Ways and Means Committee. And we were in rooms, and what was the conversation about? The county administrator would come in and say, here's what we have to spend to maintain service levels at the level of last year, and here's our projection of the sales tax and other revenues, state aid. Here's the gap. The gap filler is the property tax. We're going to have to raise the property tax by 8%. Hypothetical number. And we would say, we won't do that. We don't want to raise the property tax by more than the cost of living increase, say 3%. Now, what were we really talking about? We had to find other money to pay that bill, fund balance or other revenues, or, well, I hope not reinterpret the sales tax revenue beyond reason, you know, but that was a temptation, to tell the truth. And we wanted that property tax contained and controlled. We thought that's what the citizens wanted. We thought that's what we wanted from our value system, and that's what we chose to focus upon. Sometimes we got it down to where we wanted it to be. Sometimes we couldn't achieve it fully, but that was a goal. So the governor is saying, across the state, in most localities, most of the time, I want you to do what you say you want to do. Now, we haven't thought about that, I think, or at least the local officials I talk to, school district superintendents and county officials I talk to and town officials I talk to, haven't thought about that because the guy's making us do it. He's throwing us into the briar patch. Now, and the threat is unpleasant. If I'm blamed for somebody not getting their rebate check, well, my reelection is at risk. It's an unpleasant threat. So, what do we do? We resist it. Why are you making us do it? We create maybe some backdoor escape passages, some of which are justified, and NYSEG's achievement of allowing demonstrable economies are rising from collaboration from 2012 forward to count in this process, that's important. But we try to get some wiggle room when we should really be saying, in my opinion, or we should consider saying, because I'm not in a directive role in this speech, I'm in an advisory role in this speech, what we should be saying is, hey, here's a chance to do what we'd like to do and be heroes, if this is our value. Now, some people would argue that they'd rather incur certain additional costs than achieve containment of the property tax, depending upon what service was at stake. I may be assuming a set of values based on my experience being universal that isn't universal, but that's the premise of my suggestion. So how can we do it? So what we did in Ulster County, when we advised the county on that, was to say, by the way, Schuyler County, I just encountered in my notes for the example of the assessment collaboration. So if there's anybody from Schuyler County here, if so, forgive me for oversight and thank you for waiting. Okay, so what we did in Ulster County, I'll give you some examples. What we did in Ulster County is we prepared a report and we said, really, there are some things we all do, like plow roads. So we have to look at the things we all do and see where that can be most efficiently and effectively done. What's the list of those things that we all do? We created 3 categories. Things we all do. You know, we send people out to plow the roads. Then there's another list of things that's a little more elusive, and that is things we have to do with each other. What does that mean? Things we have to do with each other. Well, we all collaborate in our personnel system. So the county, in general, the county maintains a civil service system that serves all the local governments in the county. There are some exceptions. Some cities maintain their own civil service system. So, is there an opportunity in the things we do with each other? Now remember that sometimes the things we do with each other, we end up trying to get the other guy to pay for. Now getting the other guy to pay for it is not an economy. That's a shift in the expense. In Ulster County, we're having a big fight on, some of you may know, we failed to get our sales tax bill, our sales tax authorization renewed, because we were having a big fight between our assemblyman and our county executive on the county assumption of the safety net expenses. Only county in New York State that didn't assume those expenses. Now the assemblyman wanted to shift the expense to the county. The county executive is responsible for his budget, not our budget, but his budget, and if it shifts to him, he has to come up with the revenues. Another example is election costs. Shifting election costs doesn't save the taxpayers money. It takes the payment out of a different pocket. Is there a way we can do elections that in net terms are more economical so we can share the benefit of the lower cost? Another example I love to give has to do with taxation. Our property tax administration system gets a lot less attention than our property tax level. And when you think about it, we have town officials establishing value. There's some village officials. We have a county role in maintaining the tax maps, and we have lots of jurisdictions collecting the tax. It's a complicated network of relationships based upon the evolution of, in the late 19th century, of who does what. And it differs from some counties to another. So Herman's here, and every time you say something in this meeting, you have to say, except for Westchester. So is there some way we can do this in a smarter and better way? Because when you think about it, when I look at tax administration, I say, you know, the assessor does the valuation. Everybody uses that. But the cost and risk is with the town. The county is the guarantor of the levy. The cost is with the county. If it doesn't have the cash, it has to guarantee the levy. It has to borrow the cash, and there's a cost. So everybody has a stake in everybody else's behavior, but nobody wants to assume the responsibility because there will be a shift in the cost, potentially, without a shift in the benefit. So what if we looked at this collectively and we designed a system that would be optimally efficient? Now, that would probably disrupt a lot of the status quo. But if we asked ourselves, what is the optimal way of doing this, we'd have something to compare the status quo to now. Instead, we're asking, how can I do my piece most efficiently? And that's not a way to challenge the status quo at all. That's a way to get away a little cheaper and meet some one-year requirement, but not really do better at that function. And the third category, and I have this report, it's on our website for Ulster County. We name every function in local government, and we put them in these categories. So the third, and to my colleagues from Ulster County, read the report. That's an assignment. The comptroller's here. He reads reports, I know. He writes them. And my colleagues from the legislature certainly pay attention to me, or at least when I'm talking to them, they do. So when we are all customers, today I found out, and we of course do shared purchasing, right? But I was talking to a guy from the federal government today out in the hall, and he said, you know, we can do shared purchasing with the federal government. I didn't know that for all my study of government. So what are the opportunities? What are the opportunities when we all are customers? I said, do not accept limits. One thing that, and I'm going on a little long. I'm going to stop in 5 minutes. Is that okay? Work for you? He has a hook. Just like in vaudeville, you know, he drags me off. And this is why I'm only invited every 20 years. So the one thing that has bothered me for years is that we created this big set of governments called school districts. And we built this big wall between them and everybody else. By the way, this is unusual in the world. I go around the world and share this wisdom with people who don't speak English, so that's hard to be effective. And they have ministries of education in their local governments, and they run the schools. So all the collaborations that we can do with these very large organizations that spend tens of billions of public dollars often doing things similar to what we do in their back offices and in their administrative side, there's barriers to it in the law. And we have to take those barriers down. So one of our tasks is to identify and take barriers down, and I know that NISAC does that. Now, we have some studies going on. I'm going to give you two examples, and then I'm going to sit down. First, a non-county study. We have a project called Ulster 2020. We have 8 school districts in Ulster County. We're saying, how can they collaborate to be more effective, to lower costs, to meet the requirements that are upon them just as they're upon you? And of course, we have a BOCES. We have a very good BOCES superintendent, and it's the BOCES job. But interestingly, and by the way, the county is the broker of collaboration. It is the government that the governor is turning to, and it's the government that is regional, and it is the government that should be taking the lead. Now, we would expect that BOCES, in my opinion, we expect the BOCES to be taking the lead, but somehow the law is a little waffly about the BOCES taking the lead. It looks like the governor's not thrilled with that idea. You know, so the law is a little bit waffly. So we get the school districts together, and the people who are doing the leading are the elected officials, the member of the school boards. Now, this gives the superintendents of schools a little agita. Now, all these school board people are in the same room from all the school districts thinking about policy. God knows what will come out of that room. So we had a meeting, and they identified issues. Now, here's something that I never thought of. We're focusing, by the way, on start time for high school. Later start time for high school is proven to produce automatic improvement in performance among high school kids. And it's interesting, the reason is they don't get up. So whether they're in school at 7:15 or not, they're not awake. And the interesting, and this is clinically so. It's not because they're lazy. I always used to think it was because they're lazy. It has something, there's a physiological dimension. I was in the Army, so I commanded young people, and I had a concern about their alertness early in the day. And the fact of the matter is, this is a clinical matter. And there are less car accidents going to school if you start school later. A lot of them are driving to school. So it actually saves lives, improves performance, and saves lives. But it makes the football coach a little unhappy. It makes it harder to organize intercollegiate athletics. You know, so we have a study on everybody collaborating to start school later. We have something called the bell schedules in schools. Now, all this is new to me. I have a person who's working for me who does this. That's when the periods change over. You can't do collaboration if everybody's changing over at a different time. So we're doing a school district bell schedule map. And we're asking the schools to consider whether they can deliver education in a standard paradigm, putting pieces together in different ways. If we can do that, then we can have one Russian teacher teaching Russian for 8 schools, or we can enhance the number of languages we teach at very modest expense through BOCES. Okay, now in Albany County, we're starting out on a project where we are going to identify the areas where all the governments in the county have relatively high levels of expense through controller data. We're going to get an advisory board of governments at all layers, and we are going to analyze those, not all expense, personnel expense, and then we're going to go down to the individual employee level and see where collaboration at the individual employee level can be effective, thinking about that employee's time to retirement, the incentive system that might be offered that employee to go work half-time, in other words, and we're going to include union people on our advisory committee, so we're not going to be confrontational, we hope and expect. We're going to analyze at the employee level what's possible, rather than analyzing at the government unit level. what's possible. And our premise is that if we do that, we're going to find opportunities because we're looking at the smallest unit of analysis. Now, we got to get the data from the Civil Service Office or from the Comptroller's retirement data, and we have to be careful